Ukrainian forces appear to be closing in on the strategically important southern city of Kherson a day after Russia said it was withdrawing from the area. Kyiv says it has retaken more than 40 settlements and that if Moscow's retreat happens, full recapture of the region is likely to take at least a week, as Russia still has at least 40,000 troops there.
Moving closer to the city of Kherson. The Ukrainian flag is flying again in dozens of small towns around the regional capital. In Snihorivka, about 50 kilometers north of Kherson, people gather to thank soldiers as they enter the city. But not everyone here shares their sense of euphoria.
It's still very, very scary. When you drive through the region, you see how many villages have been bombed. There's so much destruction. Our school is destroyed. Not a single window is left. All the buildings are shattered.
For the first time since Moscow launched its invasion in February, guns have fallen silent in this village close to the front line. This man, who has been living on humanitarian aid for months, has only just heard of the liberation of neighboring Snihorivka.
There's no food, nothing there. People who were there right now told me they have no food, nothing. We have to bring them food.
Those who have survived the shelling are wondering how they will make it through the winter.
We've had no water supply since the end of February. They are bringing us drinking water to a school. We can bring water from a nearby well with our tractor, but it's not really drinkable.
Here, the two sides keep volleying rockets at each other.
Yesterday I was removing leaves, and right behind this building, it was terrible. The battle went on with machine guns.
For weeks, Ukrainian forces have been advancing on Kherson. Its loss would leave Russia with few territorial gains since the beginning of the war.
Let's join our correspondent Nick Connolly in the Ukrainian capital. Welcome, Nick. How far is Ukraine from completely retaking Kherson city and region?
Well, as usual, Phil, the Ukrainian military authorities are keeping pretty tight-lipped about the kind of occupational situation on the ground. We heard from the defense minister with that prediction about it taking a week. But, you know, given the kind of very nervous and sometimes even panicked kind of messages, reports we're getting from pro-Kremlin military bloggers over the last few hours, over the night, which seems to suggest there's a kind of total collapse in Russian morale and Russian logistics in and around Kherson, that the command has taken all the kind of big equipment, bits of kit away to the other bank of the river, the kind of anti-aircraft defenses, basically leaving lots of the Russians there very vulnerable to Ukrainian artillery and drone attacks. This could end up going faster. Obviously, we'll remember that the Ukrainians have been very nervous in recent days that this might have been a trap, some kind of provocation to lure the Ukrainians in and then see them face pretty stiff resistance from kind of some of the better trained Russian units. That doesn't seem to be the case right now. It doesn't seem like the Russians were able to plan this well. So for all of kind of the Russian command's announcement that this was a planned and coordinated withdrawal, it seems like this is actually turning into a bit of a rout.
And what are Ukrainian troops finding as they liberate settlements?
Finding lots of mines, lots of booby traps. We've had widespread reports of looting by the Russian troops leaving. And if the reports going out of Kherson are to believe, there's also been methodical and kind of planned attempts to destroy the civilian infrastructure in Kherson, to basically leave Ukraine with a destroyed city. So we've heard about mobile phone infrastructure, even things like the kind of sewerage system and the power system being destroyed. So for the people who are left in Kherson, it's important to remember that there are comparatively few people still left there, because lots have left over the recent months, and most recently in the last few weeks they've been kind of put under pressure by the Russians to move into Russian-controlled territory on the other bank of the river. This is going to be a very, very difficult place for civilians to survive the winter.
Right, and is this really a pivotal moment in this conflict, or merely symbolic?
Well, you're right in the sense that this isn't the first major defeat that the Russians have faced in recent months here in Ukraine. We all remember what happened in Kharkiv, in and around Kharkiv, earlier on in the autumn. It is important because it means basically Russia now cannot cut Ukraine off from the sea, from its ports. That attempt to kind of take that Black Sea coastline is now essentially over. I think the bigger deal is about the kind of internal Russian story. If it turns out that Russia isn't able to protect some of its best troops who are in Kherson and bring them out in a kind of controlled fashion, if these claims of a kind of planned withdrawal turn out not to be realizable, and lots of Russian soldiers end up feeling like that they've been basically thrown to their own, left to their own devices, kind of thrown to their own fates by their command, that could, arbor something much worse in terms of the kind of broader morale and Russia's ability to dig in on the other bank of the river. The plan seemingly is to kind of dig in on the eastern bank of the river and try and hope that Ukraine kind of runs out of steam, loses the kind of economic war, and its western partners start putting pressure on Kyiv to come some kind of negotiated settlement. But right now, if these reports are to be believed from Kherson, then the Russian military leadership is really not doing well at communicating with its own people and offering them some kind of hope that this is a war that Russia can win in some form.
Thanks for that, Nick. Nick Connolly in Kyiv. And we can get to more on this from Mike Martin. He's a senior visiting research fellow at the Department of War Studies at King's College London and a former British Army officer. Welcome back to DW, Mike. What's your assessment of the way Russia's handling this withdrawal?
So I think it's important to note that a withdrawal, particularly one under fire, so a retreat, is probably the most difficult military manoeuvre to conduct. Russia hasn't done, as we heard in your package, they're not doing particularly well. Usually you don't announce withdrawals beforehand. Obviously, we saw that from the defense minister and the head of the Russian forces in Ukraine. And it appears that not all of the units were told. Some of the units that were able to cover, so artillery and air defense, were pulled out. And there are reports now of up to 10, 15 or 20,000 Russian soldiers on the wrong bank of the river. And some of the crossing points are being shelled by Ukraine as well. So it's not been a particularly well executed plan from the Russians. OK, so what happens then once the Russians withdraw to the other side of the Dnipro River? Do they sort of dig in there, or is there going to be more withdrawal? So over the last month or so, the Russians have been building defensive lines on the other side of the river. In fact, they've built, 3 sets of defensive lines, and they've positioned artillery to enable them to fire over the river. I think what actually the Russians are trying to do is set up for winter. So winter's coming. There's about a month left of fighting, really. And what they're doing is they're hoping that with this withdrawal, they'll be able to settle for the winter and then do something in the spring.
Right. So the idea of a Ukrainian route across the Dnipro, that's unlikely, because this is where the Russians are likely to make their stand. It's
quite wide at that point. The Dnipro is at points 5 miles wide, but even in the city is quite a wide river. So if I were Ukraine, I would not be attempting a river crossing under fire. I think it's important to note that much further to the east, the Ukrainians are already, so sort of Zaporizhia direction, the Ukrainians are already over the Dnipro River. So if they were looking to make advances into Russian territory, I'd do it from where they've already crossed the river.
Given the symbolic and strategic importance of Kherson city, do you think Russia is likely to try to recapture it?
So they may have the intent to do that. I think the question is, do they have the capability? At the beginning of the war, they only managed to capture Kherson because, they did it in the first couple of days of the war. Allegedly, some of the Ukrainian civilian administrators switched sides. To take it once the Ukrainians are back in there and dug in across a river, I think it's going to be very difficult for either side to get across that river.
Right. And of course, lots of people are seeing this as a great victory for the Ukrainians. But I'm intrigued as to what you think about this. Is this Russia performing badly, or is this Ukraine using Western weapons well?
It's both. And it's, Russia has performed very poorly since the beginning of the war, both in terms of what we're seeing now, the sort of basic execution of military tactics, but also they haven't been very good at supply and their morale has been very, very low. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, have had a fairly clear, realistic strategy. They're competent in the way they execute military maneuvers. And of course, they are well supplied, not just with Western weaponry, which of course is very important, but actually also Western intelligence. There's a lot of Western targeting intelligence that's given to the Ukrainians that enables them to target Russian forces and units effectively.
That's great. Thank you so much for joining us. Mike Martin from the Department of War Studies, King's College London.
Well, following the midterms, the Biden administration has been quick to assure Ukraine that it will be business as usual. The weapons and the aid will continue flowing, whatever the outcome. The White House brushing off concerns that a Republican-controlled House of Representatives in Congress could perhaps pull the plug on assistance for Kyiv in the war with Russia. Here's the president's special assistant.
Our expectation is that the outcome of the midterm elections is not going to impact U.S. policy towards Ukraine in the least. There's strong bipartisan support for all the actions we've taken to support the Ukrainian people and government and hold Russia accountable. So, no, we don't expect any major change.
And that comes as Russia says that its troops have started withdrawing from the strategic city of Kherson in southern Ukraine. Ukraine's army chief says that it's too soon to say whether or not that this is really happening. Kherson was the first major city to fall after Russia began its invasion back in February. It's the only regional capital that is still under Russian control. The move is being seen as a major setback for Moscow, but some say the withdrawal could be a trap set by the Russians. We have more on this now with Domitila Zagromoso. She is an expert in Russian foreign and security policy at King's College London. Domitila, it's good to have you on the program. Russia is saying that its forces are retreating from Kherson, but Ukraine, the military, is not rushing in to fill any vacuum. Why is that?
Well, I think as was said by your correspondent, I mean, the Ukrainians are very worried that this could be a trap and that, they could face some kind of ambushes. I mean, what the reporting is saying is also that there are a lot of sort of roadblocks, mines. So it is a difficult advancement, and it's not an easy one. But I think that this announcement was made primarily for internal Russian consumption, primarily to prepare the Russian public to the sort of the full withdrawal from the area, from the city of Kherson and from sort of the north western bank of the Dnieper River. So I think we need to see it within that sort of perspective.
So you're saying that this announcement is basically a PR move for the Russian military to prepare the Russian public for what? For a defeat or for yet another blow to this campaign?
I think that if they look at what had happened in the areas of Kharkiv when there was a major sort of advance by Ukrainian forces and there was sort of a collapse of Russian forces in that area in the northeast, that came as a real shock to many in Russia, and it was seen as carried out in a very sort of unprofessional manner without taking care about soldiers and equipment. So what the Russians are trying to do, if they are actually determined to withdraw, is to do it in a more sort of organized and professional manner, and this is going to take several days, if not weeks. So I think what they are trying to do is to sort of prepare the population to this event, which is in many ways a serious defeat. I mean, as we know, a few weeks ago, this was considered the capital of one of the annexed regions. So also we must consider that now the position of the Russian government is much weaker. They've relied on mobilization of conscripts, so the population is much more involved in this war, so it requires sort of additional explanations, and now the sort of with this change at the top of who is in charge of the operations in Ukraine from the Russian point of view, there is an attempt to have better professionalism, better communication, and I think this is really part of it. Of course, it makes sense for Ukrainians to be cautious. But what is interesting is that today we see very heavy fighting in Bakhmut, in the Bakhmut area. So this does not mean that Russia is sort of giving up and is not going to fight any longer. I mean, there are other areas where Russia is fighting quite intensely, and there is a lot of concern around the Bakhmut area at the moment.
Let me pick up there on what you said about an attempt to bring more professionalism in the leadership of this war. Just a couple of weeks ago, a new commander was of this war, this campaign was put into place, Sergei Sorokin, and he was put into place by Vladimir Putin. Now, he is the one who has announced this withdrawal on state television. It looks like Vladimir Putin could be using this man to keep his distance away from any possible military defeats. Is that a correct assessment in your opinion?
I think what is happening is probably that this new commander, Surovikin, is trying to find a way to hold positions more effectively and to reduce Ukrainian advances. And that requires that they build a more effective line of defense along the southern or eastern banks of the Dnieper River, and that's what they're actually doing. So I think what Putin is thinking is that now maybe with a more professional individual in charge, there is a chance maybe to stop Ukrainian advances and maybe to gain some terrain. So I think that the Russians are not giving up. They're not thinking that this is a major loss. And this is also being sort of portrayed in the Russian media as a necessary retreat to save men so that at a later stage we can come back. So it's seen really as sort of saving men for a later stage where we can then come back when they're better prepared and more sort of better equipped. So I think we have to really also understand how this is being sold to the Russian public, not as a major defeat, but as a sort of rational move to better protect the areas that they control now and to maybe think that in the future they can try to conquer these territories again, which I think is kind of very unlikely at the moment. And what it also shows is that, yes, sorry.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I just wanted to say thank you. We appreciate your time and insights tonight. This is valuable analysis, too, an insight into what is actually going on, also maybe in the minds of the military in Russia. Thank you.